What happens when a country that has stayed silent for 4 years suddenly stops staying silent? 3 drones entered its sky. 3 drones fell from it. And somewhere in Moscow, for the first time in this entire war, nobody said a word back. Before we go further, if this story pulls you in even a little, hit that like button right now, because it tells this channel to bring you more truth like this. Subscribe if you want to understand the world instead of just scrolling past it. And if you know someone who still thinks this war is far away from them, send them this video, because after today, they will realize it never was. Now let's go back to the beginning of this story, because the beginning is where the real shock lives. For 4 years, Romania watched. It watched drones cross its border. It watched wreckage fall near its villages. It watched fires start on the riverbank just a few hundred meters from its own soil. And every single time, it did nothing but write a report. Radar catches something. A jet goes up. The drone flies past. Nobody fires. A statement gets released saying there is no evidence of intent. Life continues. That was the pattern. That was the rhythm. Year after year, night after night, the same quiet acceptance. Then, in the space of just 3 days, that rhythm broke completely. On a Friday in late July, Romanian radar picked up a target crossing from the direction of Ukraine. It moved deep into Romanian land, following a path near the Danube. Fighter jets scrambled into the sky. 2 of them tried first and failed to bring the target down. Then a Romanian F-16 took over, fired, and for the first time in the history of this country, a Russian-made drone was destroyed in Romanian skies. It fell into a wheat field. Investigators later confirmed the wreckage matched a Shahed-type drone, the same kind Russia has used to batter Ukrainian cities for years. One day was strange. 2 days would be alarming. But the next morning it happened again. A second drone entered near the Danube Delta. Jets went up again. It was shot down again. Then Sunday came. Just after 10 in the morning, radar caught a third target crossing into Romanian airspace above a coastal town. Within minutes, a Romanian F-16 pilot fired and brought it down over the Black Sea, close to Romanian territorial waters, only a few kilometers from a quiet fishing town that had never seen anything like this before. 3 drones, 3 days, 3 kills. And from Russia, silence, no confirmation, no denial, no comment at all. And when a government, usually quick to explain away every accusation, suddenly goes quiet, that silence tells you something. It tells you they were caught without a script. Romania's president did not stay quiet, though. He called the repeated violation of his country's airspace inadmissible and intolerable, reminding everyone that this was not just Romanian sky, it was NATO sky and European Union sky too. The Prime Minister called it unacceptable. The Foreign Ministry summoned the Russian ambassador, and a senior NATO spokesperson backed the same message publicly, calling the behavior reckless and dangerous for everyone. This was not the reaction of a country brushing off an accident. This was the reaction of a country that had finally decided enough was enough. So why now? Why, after 4 long years of quiet tolerance, did the response suddenly change? To understand that, you need to understand what Romania has actually been living through since this war began. It shares a border of over 600 kilometers with Ukraine, and the most sensitive part of that border runs along the Danube River, right where it meets the Black Sea. On the other side of that river sit Ukrainian ports that Russia has been hammering night after night, trying to choke off the grain and goods moving through them. Those ports sit just a few hundred meters from Romanian soil. When missiles and drones rain down on the Ukrainian side, the debris does not respect borders. It falls wherever gravity takes it. Sometimes that means a crater in a Romanian field. Sometimes that means a drone drifting for nearly an hour over Romanian villages before finally leaving without ever being touched. For years, the explanation was always the same. These are stray weapons. These are guidance failures. These are unintentional spillovers from strikes meant for Ukraine. And in many individual cases, that explanation was probably true. But when the same pattern repeats itself for the 4th year in a row, when drones keep finding their way over the same stretch of land again and again, the difference between an accident and a message starts to disappear. Because whether it was random or deliberate, the outcome for the people living in those villages is exactly the same. Sirens, fear, wreckage at their doorstep. And it was not just wreckage falling from the sky. Just months before these 3 days, a drone struck an apartment building in a Romanian city, injuring 2 people. That was the first time in this entire war that a strike like this had hit a populated area inside a NATO country. Around the same time, a maritime drone exploded inside a Romanian port. Piece by piece, incident by incident, the danger stopped being theoretical and started becoming personal for ordinary Romanian families. Local officials in the Danube region say drone debris has now landed on Romanian soil dozens of separate times since the war began, and until that Friday in July, not one of those incidents ended with a single shot fired in response. So the pressure had been building for a long time before this. Romania's top defense official had spent months publicly pushing for the legal right to shoot down these threats instead of only watching them. And earlier this same summer, lawmakers finally passed a bill giving the military exactly that power: the authority to destroy, neutralize, or take control of drones illegally entering Romanian airspace. That is the piece almost nobody talks about. The gun was loaded weeks before these 3 days happened. What changed on that Friday was not the law, it was the decision to actually pull the trigger. And that decision did not happen in isolation. It happened inside a much bigger story that had already been unfolding across the entire eastern edge of NATO for almost a year. Rewind to a night the previous September when Russia launched one of its largest air assaults on Ukraine. During that chaos, close to 20 drones drifted into Polish airspace, a NATO member. Poland's response was massive. Fighter jets from multiple allied nations went up together. Patriot missile batteries activated. It was the very first time in NATO's history that member state forces engaged and destroyed hostile drones inside alliance airspace during live operations. But that night also revealed something uncomfortable. A missile fired at one of the drones missed its target and landed in the roof of a house instead. Nobody was seriously hurt, but the message was clear. Answering a cheap, disposable drone with an expensive precision missile is a dangerous and costly gamble, both financially and physically. Poland's government felt the moment was serious enough to invoke NATO's emergency consultation clause. Within days, the alliance launched a much larger operation to reinforce the eastern flank with more jets and more air defense systems stretching from northern to southern Europe. And then, almost like clockwork, more incidents followed across the following weeks. A Russian drone drifted deep into Romanian skies for nearly 50 minutes without a single shot fired. Days later, Russian fighter jets flew through the airspace of a Baltic nation for over 10 minutes, prompting that country to not only invoke the same emergency clause, but to call an emergency United Nations Security Council session, something it had not done in decades. Around the same period, unexplained drones forced the temporary shutdown of 2 major European airports. A jamming scare even affected an aircraft carrying a top European official. In the middle of all this, a large joint military exercise between Russia and its ally Belarus added another layer of tension, pushing neighboring Poland to close its border crossings entirely, worried that the drills might be covering something more dangerous happening quietly underneath. When you line all of these moments up, side by side, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. This was not a string of unrelated accidents scattered across a continent. This looked like a slow, deliberate pressure test, stretching from the Baltic states in the north all the way down to the Black Sea in the south. Each incursion quietly measuring the same questions. How fast do the radars react? How long before fighter jets are in the air? How far can you push before someone finally shoots back? For months, intelligence officials across the eastern flank had been warning that this pressure would only grow. And these 3 days in Romania were the moment that warning stopped being a prediction and became reality. Before we go deeper into what this actually means for the rest of Europe, take a second and hit subscribe if you have not already. Not because I am asking for a favor, but because stories like this move fast, and missing the next update means missing the next piece of the puzzle. Now here is where the story becomes even more important, because Romania is not just another country on the map. It sits at the center of 3 overlapping crises that most people never connect. The first is military. Romania has spent years building up a growing fleet of F-16 fighter jets, taking over aircraft that used to belong to other NATO countries, while also preparing the path toward newer F-35s. Its main air base is on track to become one of the largest NATO installations on the entire continent. And during these very 3 days, you could see a preview of what that future looks like in practice. Italian fighter jets and Romanian F-16s work together, engaging the same threat as part of one coordinated system. Belgium has also placed hundreds of its own troops inside Romania as part of the alliance's broader eastern defense effort, a quiet reminder that this border is no longer just Romania's problem to solve alone. Romania has also begun using a newer, cheaper counter-drone system built specifically to intercept these low-cost threats without burning through expensive missiles every time. This was not one country acting alone. This was a rehearsal for a shared Black Sea shield involving multiple allied nations working as a single unit. The second crisis sits just next door in Moldova. Just days before these 3 drone incidents, Romania's president stood shoulder to shoulder with Moldova's president at a summit focused on security guarantees for the region. Moldova has faced its own quiet war for years, energy pressure used as a political weapon, elections shadowed by disinformation, a breakaway region on its eastern edge still hosting Russian troops under the label of peacekeepers. Moldova has never faced open invasion, but it has faced something almost as damaging, a constant, grinding hybrid pressure designed to pull it away from the West, without ever firing a single declared shot. The only real buffer standing between that pressure and something far worse has always been Ukraine's resistance and Romania's ability to control its own sky. When Romania draws a harder line in its airspace, that message travels straight into Chisinau as reassurance. The third crisis is the Black Sea itself. Ukraine's naval drone campaign has already pushed much of Russia's fleet away from the western coastline. As a result, the grain and shipping routes that keep global food supply chains moving have leaned harder onto the western shore, exactly where Romania sits. Together with two neighboring nations, Romania has been quietly building a joint maritime security partnership, covering everything from mine clearance to coordinated patrols. In this picture, Romania's airspace is not just Romanian airspace. It is the forward wall protecting the western edge of the entire Black Sea, and by extension, a wall protecting the flow of food and fuel that much of the world quietly depends on without even realizing it. Now let's talk about the single most important shift hiding inside these 3 days, because this is bigger than 3 destroyed drones. This is about an unwritten rule quietly changing across the whole alliance. For 4 years, the real, unspoken doctrine along NATO's eastern border was simple. Watch, track, escort the threat away if possible, treat actually firing as an absolute last resort, something almost unthinkable. That caution existed for real reasons. Fear of provoking a wider war, fear of falling wreckage, hurting civilians, and a deep, uncomfortable question. Sitting underneath everything, is one single drone really worth the risk of a larger confrontation? That old caution cracked for the first time the night Poland engaged that massive drone swarm, but that was one extraordinary night responding to an extraordinary number of threats all at once. What Romania has just done is different and honestly more significant. It fired on single individual drones, 3 separate times, on 3 separate days in a row. That is not a one-time emergency reaction. That is the beginning of routine. And when caution turns into routine defense, it becomes something far more powerful. It becomes deterrence. The message underneath these 3 shoot-downs is simple and unmistakable. NATO airspace will now be actively defended, not just monitored. Violating it will no longer be treated as a normal, tolerable cost of doing business. There is an important detail here that deserves real attention, though. This new firmness applies specifically to unmanned drones, not to manned aircraft. When Russian fighter jets crossed into that Baltic nation's airspace months earlier, nobody fired on them. Shooting down a drone with no pilot aboard is a very different level of risk compared to shooting down an aircraft carrying a human being. NATO seems to be drawing its new line very precisely right here. Escort and de-escalate when it comes to manned aircraft. Destroy without hesitation when it comes to unmanned threats. It is a careful, calculated balance between showing strength and avoiding a spiral towards something far more dangerous. But this new approach comes with its own hidden cost, and it is worth being honest about it. A single Shahed-style drone might cost tens of thousands of dollars to build. The missile used to shoot it down can cost many times more than that. Do this repeatedly, night after night, across an entire border, and the math becomes unsustainable over time. That is exactly why European nations are now racing to build a layered, low-cost defense system behind these expensive jets, cheaper interceptor drones, better sensor networks, and electronic jamming tools designed to bring down these threats without burning through expensive missiles every single time. What Romania just did should be understood as the expensive bridge, holding the line until that cheaper long-term wall is fully built. If you are starting to see how deeply these pieces connect, do me one favor, drop a single word in the comments right now, just the word watching, so I know how many of you are actually following this all the way through. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. Now, here is where the story becomes personal for Putin himself. In the very same window of time that these 3 drones were falling from Romanian skies, Putin made a public statement about Ukraine's future, suggesting that its western territories, land that had once belonged to neighboring countries before being folded into Ukraine, would eventually and inevitably return to their old borders, naming Hungary, Romania, and Poland directly, while insisting that Russia remained the only real guarantor of Ukraine's territorial integrity. Read that statement carefully, and it works on 2 levels at once. On the surface, it is the same old argument Russia has used for years to question Ukraine's legitimacy as an independent nation. But underneath that, surface sits a much sharper message aimed directly at Ukraine's neighbors. Borders, it suggests, are not permanent. Maps can be redrawn if the moment is right. Delivering that message during the exact same week Romania was actively shooting down Russian drones did not scare Bucharest into backing down. If anything, it explained precisely why Romania was no longer willing to sit back and simply watch. It is almost impossible to hear those words and not connect them directly to the drones falling from the sky that same week. One hand pointing at a map, the other testing exactly how far it can push before someone pushes back. There's also a quieter but equally important story happening on the western side of this alliance. When that massive drone swarm first crossed into Poland the previous September, some of the earliest reactions from across the ocean suggested it might have simply been a mistake, an accident rather than a deliberate act. That gap in tone between the urgency felt by frontline countries and the more cautious language coming from farther away has always been something Moscow seemed to quietly count on. But something as concrete and repeated as 3 shoot-downs in 3 consecutive days is much harder to wave away as coincidence. It forces a much sharper question onto every ally sitting further from the front line. Do you support this response or not? It is also worth remembering who is standing behind this decision inside Romania itself. Its president had been in office for barely a year, having built much of his campaign around defending the country's Western alignment and standing firm against exactly this kind of pressure. This response was not just a military decision. It carried real political weight behind it too, and it will be remembered by voters long after the headlines fade. There is one more direction worth watching closely, and that is north, toward the Baltic Sea and the small Russian territory wedged between Poland and Lithuania, packed with missile systems and electronic warfare equipment. Russia has used flights toward that isolated territory as an excuse before, whenever its aircraft have drifted into neighboring airspace. If the firmer rule that Romania just established travels north, 2 things get tested at the same time. Whether unmanned incursions near that territory now carry a real risk of being shot down just like they do over the Black Sea, and whether that same careful balance between strength and restraint can hold in a much narrower, much more crowded stretch of sky. The line drawn over Romania this week may end up being redrawn over the Baltic in the months ahead. Same rule, different coordinates on the map. So where does this story go from here? There are really only a few paths this can take. The first possibility is that this pressure quietly fades. Moscow recalculates the cost of these violations, adjusts its flight patterns, and incidents along this particular stretch of border become rarer. The tension cools into just another entry in a long list of wartime friction points. The second possibility is that the pressure simply relocates somewhere else. If the door in Romania has now closed, the same kind of testing could easily shift toward the Baltic. States, toward Poland once again, or even below the surface entirely, toward undersea cables and pipelines, a tactic already used repeatedly over the past 2 years in northern European waters. The third possibility, and the most serious one, is escalation. Larger drone swarms, faster jet-powered targets instead of slower propeller drones. And the darkest scenario of all, a moment when falling wreckage does not land in an empty field, but in a populated area, turning a technical military incident into a full political crisis overnight. Whichever path this takes, one thing has already changed for good. The initiative no longer sits entirely with Moscow. For 4 years, Russia held the ability to test, probe, and push, while everyone else could only watch, record, and hope. These 3 days in Romania proved that testing is no longer free. Every single violation from now on carries a real, immediate cost. To be fair and balanced here, Russia has never officially confirmed these particular drones as its own, and proving deliberate intent behind any single incursion remains genuinely difficult. Nor is the Western alliance perfectly united on how far this new firmness should go. That debate is far from settled, but the center of that debate has shifted permanently. The question is no longer whether these threats should be shot down. The question now is simply how to make doing so faster, cheaper, and completely normal. For 4 years, the pattern along NATO's eastern edge followed one simple sentence. A drone enters, jets scramble, everyone holds their breath, and eventually someone writes a report. In just 72 hours, that sentence changed completely. Now it enters and it gets shot down. And when the core action inside a sentence changes, the entire meaning of the story changes along with it. Here is the final and most important way to see everything you just heard. Russia built this entire war around the idea of isolating Ukraine, cutting it off piece by piece from the rest of Europe. 4 years later, look at what has actually happened instead. Ukraine's Western neighbor is now actively shooting down Russian drones in its own sky. Nations to the north are tightening their air defenses together like never before, and for the very first time, both ends of this alliance, from the Baltic in the north to the Black Sea in the south, are speaking the exact same language of defense. If this pressure campaign was ever meant to pull the alliance apart, it appears to have done the exact opposite. It did not weaken the eastern flank. It welded it together. What happens next will be answered by watching just a few simple things. Whether another drone crosses that same stretch of the Danube again, whether Romania's response comes just as fast the next time, and whether Moscow finally breaks its silence, and if it does, whether the very first word out of its mouth is denial, apology, or something far more dangerous, a threat. A line has now been drawn in the sky above Romania, and for the first time in this long, exhausting war, the whole world is watching to see exactly who dares to step close to it next. So tell me honestly, do you think Romania's 3 days just stopped this pressure campaign in its tracks? Or do you think it simply pushed it somewhere else along the map? Type your answer in the comments below, because this conversation matters more than most people realize. And if this video gave you a clearer picture of what is really happening right now, share it with someone who needs to see it too.